Good afternoon. Since the May meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to spread globally with wide-ranging and deep social economic effects. Current forecasts from the IMF show global GDP contracting by about 4.9% this year. The deepest contractions are expected in the second quarter of 2020, with gradual recoveries in the third and fourth quarters of the year. The strength of the global economic recovery will depend in part on the control of new virus outbreaks, the extent of supply and demand losses, and expectations of future growth in investment and productivity. The crisis has caused extreme volatility in financial asset prices, with sharp and deep market sell-offs followed by a partial recovery. Investor appetite has generally improved, reflected in a weaker US dollar and strong flows to emerging markets. However, the general environment continues to reflect pronounced levels of risk aversion due to uncertainty about future global economic prospects. Policy responses to the crisis have generally been robust. This week, the European Union agreed to a large targeted stimulus package primarily to support investment. Other monetary and policy and fiscal authorities continue to provide accommodation and support. Emerging and developing economies are generally constrained by less policy space, currency risks, and tight global financial conditions. The international financial institutions continue to make available extraordinary levels of emergency financial support to respond to the pandemic. The COVID-19 outbreak has major health, social, and economic impacts, presenting challenges in forecasting domestic and global economic activity. The compilation of accurate economic statistics will also remain severely challenged. Our second quarter estimate for output has been revised lower. The bank currently expects GDP in 2020 to contract by 7.3% compared to 7% contraction forecast in May. Even as the lockdown is relaxed in coming months, for the year as a whole, investment, exports and imports are expected to decline sharply. Job losses are also expected to rise further. Easing of the lockdown has supported growth in recent weeks, and high-frequency activity indicators show a pickup in spending from extremely low levels. However, getting back to pre-pandemic activity levels will take time. GDP is expected to grow by 3.7% in 2021 and by 2.8% in 2022. South Africa's terms of trade and commodity export prices remain high. While oil prices are generally low, they have increased since the May meeting. The Brent crude oil price is expected to average about $40 per barrel in 2020, rising to $45 per barrel in 2021 and $50 per barrel in 2022. Exceptionally accommodative policies and the relaxation of lockdowns in many advanced economies have supported a partial recovery in global financial markets. However, financing conditions for emerging markets remain uncertain, contributing to currency weakness. The rand has depreciated by 15.2% against the US dollar since January, and appreciated by 8.8% since the May meeting of the MPC. The implied starting point for the rand forecast is 17 rands 93 cents to the US dollar, compared with 18 rands 40 at the time of the previous crisis. Resident investors have increased purchases of long-term bonds, helping to ease yields in recent weeks. However, the yield curve is exceptionally steep, reflecting credit risk associated with high public borrowing needs. The bank's headline consumer price inflation forecast averages 3.4% in 2020 and is marginally lower than previously forecast at 4.3% in 2021 and 2022. The average for core inflation is lower at 3.3% in 2020, remaining broadly stable at 3.9% in 2021 and 4.1% in 2022. The overall risks to the inflation outlook at this time appear to be balanced. Global producer price and food inflation have bottomed out. Local food price inflation is expected to remain contained. Risks to inflation from currency depreciation are expected to stay muted, while pass-through remains low. However, electricity and other administered prices are still a concern. Upside risks to inflation would also emerge from heightened fiscal risks and sharp reductions in the supply of goods and services. Expectations of future inflation continued to soften for this year, but are broadly around the midpoint of the target band for 2021. Market-based expectations for short and medium-term inflation have eased slightly, while long-term inflation expectations remain higher. Despite sustained higher levels of country financing risks, the committee notes that the economic contraction and slow recovery will keep inflation well below the midpoint of the target range for this year. Barring risks outlined earlier, inflation is expected to be well contained over the medium term, remaining close to the midpoint in 2021 and 2022. Against this backdrop, the MPC decided to cut the repo rate by 25 basis points, taking it to 3.5% per annum with effect from 24th July 2020. 3 members preferred a cut of 25 basis points and 2 preferred to keep rates on hold. The implied path of policy rates over the forecast period, generated by the quarterly projection model, indicates one repo rate cut of 25 basis points in the fourth quarter of 2020 and stays of 2021. Monetary policy can ease financial conditions and improve the resilience of households and firms to the economic implications of COVID-19. In addition to continued easing of interest rates, the SARB has relaxed regulatory requirements on banks and has taken important steps to ensure adequate liquidity in domestic markets. These actions are intended to free up more capital for lending by financial institutions to households and firms. As we have indicated previously, monetary policy cannot on its own improve the potential growth rate of the economy or reduce fiscal risks. These should be addressed by implementing prudent macroeconomic policies and structural reforms that lower costs generally and increase investment opportunities, potential growth, and job creation. Such steps will enhance the effectiveness of monetary policy and its transmission to the broader economy. Global economic and financial conditions are expected to be volatile for the foreseeable future. In this highly uncertain environment, future actions will continue to be data dependent and sensitive to risks to the outlook. The MPC will seek to look through temporary price shocks and focus on second-round effects. As usual, the repo rate projections from the QPM remains a broad policy guide, changing from meeting to meeting in response to new data and risks. This concludes the statement of the Monetary Policy Committee, and at this stage we would then open up for questions, and as usual, please do identify yourself and the media house that you represent, and then we will then make sure that your questions are responded to. You can, of course, also use the chat function on the Zoom, and if you would like to raise your hand, you can use your electronic hand, and then we will take your question. Are there any questions coming through? There is an echo at the back. If I could remind people to please mute their microphones. Thank you. Wall Street Journal, you are recognized even if you don't know how to raise your hand.
Great, thank you. I have a question on your growth projection for this year and next year. Is that based on the country going back into a stricter lockdown, or is it based on cases rising exponentially like they are currently? Or what is sort of the underlying assumption when it comes to both economic activity being allowed and economic activity being possible given the prevalence of transmission at the moment? Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriela. Other questions? We will take a few before we take this thing further.
Governor, it's Fifi here from CNBC Africa. I also have a follow-up question on the growth projections, because a lot of the private sector individuals say that the Reserve Bank's forecasts for 2020 are conservative. So given that their forecasts are in the double digits for the contraction. So I also just want a better understanding of what is informing your projections for 2020 of the 7.3% contraction. Thank you, sir.
Any other questions?
Sorry, Governor, it's Hilary Joffe from Business Times. I'm not quite sure, I can't seem to raise my hand. This is a non-monetary policy question. Governor, South Africa's application to the International Monetary Fund for a facility under the RFI is to be considered at the IMF's board meeting next week. Now, as the central bank governor, you would have to co-sign the letter of intent with the finance minister that South Africa will be submitting to the IMF. So could I ask, has that letter yet been signed? Are you sort of comfortable with the kind of commitments that South Africa has made and that they will be achieved? Can you give us any detail on what kind of commitments have been made? And can you tell us at all why it has taken so long for South Africa to reach agreement with the IMF?
Okay, shall we take the last one in this round?
Governor, it's Pranesha from Bloomberg. Can you hear me?
Yes, Pranesha.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Governor, I wanted to ask about today's decision firstly. Why 25 basis points? Was anything higher than that discussed? Also, with inflation benign at the moment, you've kept your forecasts the same, but what's stopping you from deeper cuts at the moment? Also, looking at your GDP forecasting, to what extent as a return of power cuts as well as the prospect of localized lockdowns to curb the virus clouding that kind of outlook? And if I also just build on the loans from international finance institutions, can you just give us a bit of detail as to the role the SARB is going to play in the mechanics of this? From what I understand, these are going to be loans in US dollars. So the SARB is going to have to convert this and make the money available for the government. How does that work? And how do you ensure that the money supply is stable? Thank you.
That's quite a plateful, Pranesha. Thank you very much. Gabriela and Fifi, you asked questions about the assumptions that underpin our forecast. The assumptions, we released an assumptions sheet together with this statement. So the assumptions are there. Suffice to say that in the statement we do make reference to the fact that the extent of the uncertainty makes economic forecasting very, very difficult. And in an environment where the data that also comes out, one, data is delayed, two, is that you are emerging from a lockdown, which then means that many of the respondents might not have been able to even respond to the request for the surveys because they were closed. And forced Stats SA to make some adjustments when they released the CPI figure. They had to do some apply statistical techniques to adjust for the fact that there were certain goods and services that were generally not available. So if the goods were not available, what would you say the price would have been? So an imputation had to be made in terms of that. There was the question about the lockdown. As we stated, that the recent relaxation of the lockdown had led to a resurgence of economic activity, and we are seeing that economic activity is resurging. We had assumed that for now we are under lockdown 3, and that going forward there might be some relaxation of the lockdown. We're not sure what the nature of that relaxation would be, and we just have to continue to monitor data as it comes through and as the pandemic evolves. We have noted that the Minister of Health and the government's advisors have talked about the pandemic picking up reaching a peak in August or September, and we will see as that comes and take it from there. What we have then also had to do was to also put on an alternative scenario of what we think could happen if what we had projected as a forecast does not turns out to not to materialize, and we are faced with completely different circumstances. And so the environment is an uncertain one, and many of the forecasts out there have got caveats and qualifications. And Fifi, I had also noticed you said that our forecast is conservative. Conservative is not how the SARB can be described. Prudent, yes, we are prudent, and so when we put out anything, we make sure that we have considered as much of the information as conceivably possible, and if there are uncertainties, that we make assumptions that we believe are realistic under the circumstances. Prinesha, you asked why 25 basis points. As we had said, the two members preferred that there must be a hold. So the debate was either we are cutting by 25 basis points or we are holding. And I think that it's important to understand that the aggressive monetary policy accommodation that we embarked on from March to date has not yet really filtered through the economy, except for the borrowers who had outstanding debt at the moment. We provided this monetary accommodation in an environment where the economy was under lockdown. So it's difficult to tell what the impact of that accommodation is so far. And as the economy opens up, we will have a better idea of what impact the accommodation that we have provided so far is having on the economy. That said, getting into this meeting, given the extent of the change in the inflation outlook, given the extent of the change in the growth outlook, we deemed it necessary to provide further accommodation. So the debate in the MPC was about holding and waiting to see what new data will show us and going forward, or to make this take this step that we have taken today of making a 25 basis point cut. You had raised the issue of the, well, they were factored in the issue of the power cuts or load shedding. Our assumptions on load shedding are the same as we had earlier in the year, and we hadn't changed that. So it is that assumption had not changed. The last part of your question, Prinesha, linked to what Hilary had raised. She said that it's a non-monetary policy question, but it does have monetary policy implications. Yes, the application had gone through. We did sign the letter of intent. If you want to know what is in that letter of intent, just wait. Once the IMF makes a decision, the letter gets posted on the IMF website, so you will know exactly what it is. As the letter says, it is a letter of intent. These are the things that we are doing as a country. What then happens to the dollar flows is Prinesha's question. Previously, what you would have heard was that the dollars would be deposited in the foreign currency account of the National Treasury in the South African Reserve Bank. And as the Treasury draws it down, they would convert it to rands. We are their banker, so they would first offer those that foreign currency to us as the South African Reserve Bank, and we would then give them domestic currency. That domestic currency, of course, the Treasury will spend and will find itself into the economy and into the money market. Depending on what else is taking place in the South African money market, we could then, as the South African Reserve Bank, then make a decision as to whether we sterilize those flows or in full or in part, or we just let those flows to get into the market. Of course, this thing could have happened with any of the borrowings that the Treasury does. Earlier in the year, we know that they had indicated that they borrowed foreign in capital markets and they deposited that money with us for their future commitments. And this time round, to alleviate the pressure on the bond market, they had indicated that they would rather convert this foreign currency into rand and then bring down the amount of issuance that they have in the domestic market. That's how far I can take the questions on the IMF and the flows. Can we take the next round of questions, please? Before we get there, colleagues, members of the MPC, is there anything that anybody wants to add to what I have said? Well, if there isn't, shall we then have more questions? I see Lukanyo Mnyan. I don't know. Yes, I see. Are you having your hand up, sir?
I have, yes, Governor, if you can hear me. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Governor. Good afternoon, other members of the MPC. Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. Governor, first I wanted to ask a slightly technical question on the QPM. There's always a bit of confusion about this every meeting. When we say the model is showing 25 basis points in the fourth quarter, so but my interpretation is that this has now then been front-loaded, so it was before today's move. So i.e., then would it be fair to say that the model is showing no more moves for the rest of the year so far, even though you might change your mind in the next meeting or whatever, but what you can take from now is that basically the cycle is finished for now. That's my first question, and obviously, like, I don't know whether how you'd respond to questions around that, whether or not maybe the bank should be a bit proactive, a bit more ambitious, considering the dire economic outlook. But I also want to just ask on the bond question. I know you mentioned specifically that the resident inflows had improved, and I was wondering whether that meant foreigners were still pulling out, and then if that's the case, what are the implications for liquidity in the market going forward, and your activities in the bond market itself, whether or not there's room for you to reduce that, or whether the lack of foreign interest might see you being in the market for longer.
Thanks, Lukanyo. Other questions? I don't see any.
Oh, Governor, it's Fifi again.
Sorry.
Okay, Fifi.
Yes, so just your comment on the yield curve and how steep it was and the implications for credit risk. I just want to know what the implications then are for monetary and, if you can, fiscal policy in the near term. And then also just your support of the local bond markets. Are there any conversations, or have there been conversations in the SARB about extending the support into the corporate bond market at all, like we have seen from the Federal Reserve? Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon. Lameez Omarje from Fin24. My question is, when was the last time the repo was at 3.5%? And also a second question is, are we nearing the end of the rate cutting cycle? And is there any response from the bank for calls for more aggressive interventions, more aggressive rate cuts and more bond buying?
Hello.
Yes, Mfuneko.
Good day, Governor, and good day to the other MPC members. I do have a couple of questions. The first is, what is the future of the bank's bond buying program? Does it still remain in place as is? And how much more space does the bank have on its balance sheet to take on more bonds? And are you able to give us an indication of how long the bond buying program will last, and whether or not the MPC deems that program to have been effective? My second question is also about the steepening of the bond curve. I'm just asking, what do you see to be the significance of that? And are you concerned that perhaps the take-up of local debt is disproportionately tilted towards local investors rather than international investors? And whether or not you feel that is a result of previous MPC decisions to lower the rate and the impact that has had on the yield differential. And then a last question is, would you say that we are in a deflationary period yet, or are we approaching one? And if so, what are the implications for the future monetary policy decisions if we are in a deflationary period? Thanks.
Okay, can we take, oh no, I think this is a plate full already. Let's start with Lukanyo's question about the 25 basis points, and I would then link it back to Lameez's question. Yes, the QPM was forecasting a rate cut of 25 basis points in the fourth quarter of this year. We had front-loaded it. Now, this is done for the purpose of this MPC. But Lameez is asking a question about whether we could have acted more aggressively. And I'm saying, in the January meeting, we front-loaded the 25 basis points that was supposed to have taken place. In the March meeting, the QPM was projecting that we would be cutting rates by 75 basis points over the period. We decided to front-load the 100 basis points. Extended the lockdown period. And because of that, we brought forward a meeting and cut rates by 100 basis points. In the May meeting, the QPM projected that there would be 3 bouts of 25 basis points cut during the course of this year. We front-loaded it and cut by 50 basis points. Getting into this meeting, the QPM said 20 basis points in the fourth quarter of the year. We have decided to front-load it. Now, how much more aggressive can you be doing things that were supposed to be done later in the year and decide to do them now? That said, understand that the QPM is a guideline for us, because if we were to just religiously follow the QPM, then you don't need the MPC. We would just program the QPM, spew out what must be the policy action that gets taken. Then you do not need to employ people in the MPC to make these decisions in the MPC. But the QPM is a very important input in the MPC decision-making process. So, Lukanyo, we have brought forward the 25 basis points. And as we said, that we will continue to be data-dependent going forward. As data comes out and we understand better what else is going on in this economy, we will assess the data as it comes, and we will take appropriate decisions. The foreign inflows, we have seen the return of the foreigners, and it's not because South Africa did something spectacular to attract the foreigners back, but it is a combination of push and pull factors. One is that the monetary policy in the advanced economies has been loose for some time and continued to be so through asset purchases. That excess liquidity in the advanced economies has to find a place somewhere. And given that bond yields in many of the emerging market economies are still attractive, the money gets attracted by these bond yields, and South Africa also attracted this. There is a difference though for South Africa this time round compared to South Africa in 2009, 10, 11, and 12. The difference is that during that period, we were a high-grade issuer as a country. In other words, we had high investment grade. That is no longer the case. And by 2012, we got included in the World Government Bond Index, which then meant that an index tracking investors bought South African bonds so that they perform in accordance with the index. We lost our last investment grade rating this year, which meant that those investors no longer buy in order to be part of an index. But we have seen flows. What this means is that the flows that we have now would be very uncertain flows. And that is why once you are below investment grade, the rating agencies say that you are speculative grade issuer. And so we are now having flows that are very speculative in nature, and that exposes us to future volatility, because speculative grade investors by nature, they come in and out and are not in for the long term. And that is what we would be facing. Now, would the participation change our stance with respect to bond purchases? Let's get things clear. We got involved in bond purchases because we saw a dislocation in the South African bond market. We saw a widening of bid-offer spread, and we saw that players in the market were no longer quoting prices to each other. And that is why we stepped in. We stepped in and we think now the market is functioning. We do, however, stand ready to deploy this tool should we see any dislocation or dysfunctioning in the capital market in any part of the yield curve. Which then brought us to the question that was raised by Fifi and Mfuneko with respect to the significance of the shape of the yield curve. Well, when you look at the yield curve generally, you would have said that, well, the yield curve is telling us that inflation in the future is going to go up, and because of that, investors want to be compensated. That is one. We do not think that that is what is actually at play here, because inflation is actually well contained, and over the next 2 years, 2021 and 2022, we do not see inflation as a problem. It is within target, and it is close to the midpoint of our inflation target range, which is where we would like to see it. Of course, investors do also want to be compensated for taking risks over a longer period of time. And the reason why the yield curve rises over that period is reflective of that. But there is a dynamic in the South African capital market space. And it has to do with how steep our yield curve is compared to country peers. And what that could be reflecting is a concern about the state of public finances and future borrowings. And I think that it is in that space that you had the Minister of Finance talk about fiscal consolidation, because as an issuer, you don't control the price. The only thing you control is the quantity that you borrow. And if you would like to then see lower borrowing costs in the future, you have got to contain the borrowing. And that is the job of the ladies and gentlemen down the road at the national what does this mean, this yield curve mean for monetary policy? Monetary policy, remember, is by its nature cyclical, and it affects activity around the cycle. And what we have seen is that because there had been a very aggressive relaxation of monetary policy, what you have had is that short-term rates declined way faster than long-term rates. And that is to be expected when you relax monetary policy. What this means is that borrowers could take advantage of these low short-term rates. And one important borrower did exactly that. We have seen that the National Treasury has shifted its issuance to the short end of the yield curve because it is cheaper for them to borrow at those levels. And that in itself meant that the transmission of our monetary policy actions had been to the very rapid benefit of the fiscal authorities. What it means for future fiscal policy, again, you can talk to the ladies and gentlemen down the road. But Mfuneko, you had also asked the question about deflation. If there was the markets were pricing in deflation, the yield curve wouldn't have been steep. The yield curve would have inverted because that would have meant that the investors are expecting that inflation will be so low in the future, so buy the bonds now so that you can benefit from the capital appreciation. So the South African bond market is not pricing for deflation. And deflation is not in our base case as it stands. It's not even in an alternative scenario at the moment for us. Yes, inflation has come down, Mfuneko, but that is disinflation rather than deflation. Disinflation means that you are having inflation growing at a slower pace than in the previous periods, whereas deflation means that prices have turned negative, and that is not what we are seeing in the South African economic space at the moment. I think I have dealt with all the questions. MPC members, if there's anything I have missed or anything that you would like to add, please feel free to do so.
So, Governor, I wanted to just add 1 or 2 points. So just to remind, I think, colleagues about the fact that the bond buying program is part of our monetary policy portfolio, which is a monetary implementation tool that we utilize. And one thing that we have also emphasized in the past is that this is a two-way tool. So the toolkit is there to add liquidity to the market and also to drain liquidity from the market. And this is going to be a longer term tool that the SARB will be utilizing as part of the monetary policy implementation framework. The second issue I wanted to highlight regarding the participation of foreigners in the South African capital is that as long as we don't have sufficient domestic savings to fund our investment needs and to fund the needs of our domestic market, we will continue to need foreign participation in the domestic market because we would be accessing those foreign savings. So if we do not have sufficient savings in the domestic market to fund the needs of both government and the corporate sector, it's going to be quite important that in the future we continue to have foreign investors. Otherwise, if we have one of the players taking up all of the national savings, we will end up with a crowding out of another player. So if, for example, government were to access all of the national savings, then it would mean there is not sufficient capital for corporate investors. Thanks, Governor. I don't know if we answered Fifi's question about corporate bonds. Did we answer that?
No,
I actually wanted a
okay. So
from the governor. Yeah, thank you.
So let me talk about that quickly, Fifi. So the instruments that we consider in our participation as a SARB in the bond market, if you will recall, was to restore market functioning. And the reason why we are buying government bonds is to restore functioning in the government bond market because it is the largest bond market in the country. So unlike in the United States, where the corporate bond market is quite large, the South African corporate bond market is quite small, and the instruments that are sold there are not very liquid. Some of them are private placements, and some of the instruments are bought and held by the banks. So if you have an instrument like that, that's not very liquid. When you buy it as a central bank, as part of your portfolio, then you have challenges in terms of how you can utilize that instrument in the way that I described earlier to add liquidity to the market and to drain liquidity to the market. So we have had discussions with corporate treasurers and with various market participants about this issue, but at this stage, our corporate bond market is not at that level of maturity. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Lameez asked a question about when was the repo rate this low. The current repo system was introduced in 1998, and as of the May meeting, the repo rate was at its lowest since the system was introduced. So what we have done today is that we have taken it even lower than that. Okay, any other questions?
Governor, there's one question from Miriam Isa on the chat line. Maybe I can just answer it.
Deal with it then, sir.
Yeah, the question is, why is it that the starting point for the exchange rate is 17 Rand, whatever, rather than the spot price of the exchange rate, which is 16 Rand 60? Just to say to Miriam, it would be very dangerous for us to use the spot price in a variable that moves hour by hour or day by day. Typically, what happens is that we average it out in the past, and this is relevant now too. We average out relative to the last MPC meeting over a period of time, anywhere from 1 month to 3 months. So using the spot price would be methodologically not appropriate. The idea is to take a period of time because you'll get good days, you get bad days, and the averaging process is what matters for the starting point. Thank you.
Okay, and Miriam, just add to say that this is an implied starting point. So it's derived from the nominal effective exchange rate. So that is how we arrived at this thing. We do not extract this figure directly from the markets. Okay. Mfuneko.
Hi, Governor, thanks.
There's a follow-up question.
Yes, sort of. The first one is, are you just able to explain to us what, if any, coordination that happens with National Treasury, considering the extraordinary circumstances that have been triggered by COVID-19, and whether or not this coordination happens within the parameters of the MPC or outside the parameters of the MPC? And then just the second question is, has the bank observed sort of any disruption in the bond market due to distress at state-owned companies that issue significant amounts of debt? Thanks.
Okay, so that was the last question. Okay, thank you very much, Mfuneko. Prinesha, you have another question?
Yes, Governor, I just wanted to clarify. Did you say that we have reached the end or are nearing the end of the easing cycle?
I didn't talk about any cycle.
Can you please let us know then?
I will leave that to Rashad.
And sorry, so just one last from me, just to add to Mfuneko's point about SOE bonds, particularly the distressed ones, the conversations there then that the SARB is having to potentially support those. Are such talks taking place? Thanks, sir.
Okay, Rashad, shall we start with you and the cycle?
Yeah, thank you very much, Governor. Look, it goes back to Lukanyo's question. There's the question of what the model says, and the model says. We're not really talking of a cycle. We've been saying repeatedly that the numbers are incredibly uncertain. As we go from meeting to meeting, we want to be very more confident about what we think both the direction of GDP is and the direction of inflation. And once we kind of have a better sense of this, we factor in the data and decide whether to keep unchanged or not. And I think that's really as much as we can say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The thing about SOE is if SOEs have to raise money, they can get into the market. And as Fundi spelled out, when we talk of the corporate bond market, by the way, in South Africa, the corporate bond market is dominated by the state-owned corporations. And so what DG Chasivana said about the illiquidity of the bond market would apply to the SOCs as well. Mfuneko, coordination with the National Treasury and whether it takes place within the context of the MPC. The MPC is the MPC and it discusses monetary policy. It is an internal committee of the bank. It does not have representation of the Treasury. Whether you are in a crisis or not, the coordination of macroeconomic policy is important. And macroeconomic policy in this instance, two important components is fiscal and monetary policy. And as we have spelled out in the earlier questions about what is going to happen to these inflows that we had bought and what the Reserve Bank does about it is what you talk about when you talk of coordination. We have got formalized committees between the Reserve Bank and the Treasury to coordinate our activities. There is a standing committee on macroeconomic policy, which is co-chaired by Chris Lowald and the head of economic policy in the National Treasury. And there is a financial regulatory issues committee, which is co-chaired by Deputy Governor Naidu and the Deputy DG in the Treasury responsible for financial sector policy. And there is a standing committee on banking and financial markets, which is co-chaired by Deputy Governor Chasibana and the DG of the National Treasury. And then there is a standing committee on international matters, which coordinates our activities in engaging with international financial institutions and the various bodies through which in which South Africa participates. That is the nature of the coalition. Let me just underline this. That there is coordination does not mean that one of the authorities encroaches on the mandate of the other. The South African Reserve Bank is responsible for monetary policy, and whatever we do that reinforces what the Treasury does is the decision of the South African Reserve Bank, and it would always be done in accordance with our mandate. And without a doubt, the National Treasury and broader government make decisions about fiscal policy. It is for them to make those decisions and not for us as the bank. And that is the nature of the coordination. Well, thank you very much for your participation in this virtual press conference. We will see you again in September. Thank you very much and have a very good day.